Hello, dear viewers. Welcome back to Creeping Secrets channel. If you enjoy this tale, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. Now, let's dim the lights and dive into tonight's chilling account. Have you ever wondered what happens when time itself becomes your enemy? When the steady tick of a clock transforms into the countdown to your doom. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the Blackwood family and their cursed mansion, where a mysterious wall clock holds secrets darker than the deepest shadows. But before we dive into this chilling tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling stories that will keep you awake at night. Now, let me take you back to the autumn of 1923, to a house where time stands still, and death comes calling with each strike of midnight. The rain hammered against the windshield of the old Ford as Eleanor Blackwood drove through the winding country roads of Ravens Hollow. Lightning split the dark sky, illuminating the twisted branches of ancient oaks that seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers. She had been driving for hours, following the cryptic directions left by her late great-uncle Mortimer, a man she had never met but whose estate she had mysteriously inherited. "Turn left at the Stone Angel," she muttered, reading from the yellowed letter. "Continue until you see the iron gates of Greystone Manor." Eleanor was a practical woman of 32, a librarian from Boston who believed in facts and logic, not ghost stories and superstitions. But as she approached the imposing iron gates of the Blackwood estate, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. The mansion loomed before her like a sleeping giant, its Gothic architecture twisted into impossible angles. Gargoyles perched on the corners of the slate roof, their stone eyes seeming to follow her movement. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing but the storm clouds above. But it was the front door that caught her attention. A massive oak portal carved with symbols she couldn't recognize, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering lightning. Eleanor parked her car and gathered her courage. She had come too far to turn back now. The inheritance included not just the house, but a considerable sum of money that would solve all her financial problems. All she had to do was spend one night in the mansion to claim it, a strange condition, but one she was willing to meet. The heavy brass key turned easily in the lock, and the door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through the centuries. Eleanor stepped inside, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay, but there was something else, a metallic scent that made her stomach turn. The entrance hall was vast, with a grand staircase that curved upward into darkness. Oil paintings lined the walls, their subjects all bearing the same piercing blue eyes and sharp features that Eleanor recognized from her own reflection. The Blackwood family tree, she realized, stretching back generations. But it was the sound that stopped her cold, a rhythmic ticking that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Following the sound, she found herself in the main drawing room, where her breath caught in her throat. Against the far wall stood the most magnificent and terrifying clock Eleanor had ever seen. It rose from floor to ceiling, nearly 10 feet tall, crafted from black ebony and adorned with silver inlays that depicted scenes of death and rebirth. The pendulum swung hypnotically behind a glass panel, but it wasn't the pendulum that held her attention. It was the clock face itself. Instead of numbers, the clock bore symbols that seemed to pulse with their own dark light. The hands moved in ways that defied physics, sometimes spinning backward, sometimes stopping altogether. And at the very top of the clock, carved in elaborate script, were the words, "Tempus fugit, mors venit," time flies, death comes. Eleanor approached the clock slowly, drawn by a force she couldn't understand. As she got closer, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Embedded in the wood around the clock face were what appeared to be human teeth, yellowed with age and arranged in decorative patterns. "Beautiful, isn't it?" a voice said behind her. Eleanor spun around to find an elderly man standing in the doorway. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in the formal attire of a butler, though his clothes seemed to belong to another era. His face was pale as parchment, and his eyes held a sadness that seemed to span centuries. "I'm sorry," Eleanor stammered. "I didn't know anyone else was here. I'm Eleanor Blackwood, and I've inherited this house." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I know who you are, Miss Blackwood. I am Thaddeus, the caretaker of Greystone Manor. I've been expecting you. Expecting me? Oh yes. Every generation, a Blackwood comes to claim their inheritance. Every generation, they discover the truth about the timekeeper. He gestured toward the massive clock. That beautiful creation has been in your family for over 300 years. It was crafted by your ancestor, Cornelius Blackwood, in 1673. Eleanor found herself drawn back to the clock despite her growing unease. It's unusual. I've never seen anything like it. Nor will you ever again, Thaddeus said quietly. Cornelius was a brilliant clockmaker, but he was also a man consumed by grief. His wife, Isadora, died in childbirth, and he couldn't accept her death. He spent years studying the dark arts, searching for a way to bring her back. As if responding to the mention of its creator, the clock's ticking grew louder, more insistent. Eleanor noticed that the hands were moving faster now, spinning through what appeared to be hours in mere seconds. He made a bargain, Thaddeus continued, with something that should never have been disturbed. The clock doesn't just tell time, it controls it. But such power comes with a price. What kind of price? Eleanor asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Every generation, a Blackwood must feed the clock. At the stroke of midnight, it demands a sacrifice. If the debt isn't paid. Thaddeus trailed off, his eyes distant. That's ridiculous, Eleanor said, trying to inject some rationality into the conversation. Clocks don't demand sacrifices. They're mechanical devices, nothing more. But even as she spoke, she noticed something that made her doubt her own words. The silver inlays on the clock seemed to be moving, the depicted scenes shifting and changing. In one panel, she watched a woman being dragged into what looked like the clock's mechanism. In another, she saw a man screaming as the clock hands pierced his chest. Thaddeus led Eleanor through the mansion, showing her to a bedroom on the second floor. The room was dusty but comfortable, with a large four-poster bed and a fireplace that crackled with warmth. But Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The portraits on the walls seemed to follow her with their eyes, and she could still hear the clocks ticking, even through the thick walls. Dinner will be served at 8, Thaddeus said before leaving her alone. Eleanor unpacked her few belongings and tried to make sense of everything she'd learned. The logical part of her mind insisted that Thaddeus was simply an eccentric old man, probably suffering from some form of dementia. But the practical part, the part that had always served her well, was screaming warnings. She spent the afternoon exploring the mansion, discovering room after room filled with antiques and curiosities. In the library, she found a collection of journals written by various Blackwood ancestors. Each one told a similar story. The arrival at the mansion, the discovery of the clock, and then nothing. The entries always stopped abruptly, usually after mentioning strange dreams or visions. But it was in Cornelius Blackwood's own journal that she found the most disturbing entry. Asterisk, the demon spoke to me in dreams, promising that Isadora could live again if I built a vessel for it in this world. I have crafted the timekeeper as instructed, using materials both sacred and profane. The gears are forged from meteoric iron, the pendulum carved from the wood of a gibbet tree, and the face. God forgive me, the face is painted with blood willingly given. But the price is higher than I imagined. The demon requires a life each generation, a Blackwood life, to maintain its hold on our world. I have doomed my descendants to an eternity of servitude. Asterisk. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the entry. Whether or not she believed in demons and curses, it was clear that her ancestors had believed in them. And if the journal was accurate, she was expected to give her life to the clock at midnight. She looked at her watch. 10:47 p.m. Less than an hour and a half until midnight. Eleanor ran back to the drawing room, determined to destroy the clock before midnight arrived. But as she entered the room, she found Thaddeus standing before the timekeeper, his head bowed as if in prayer. "You can't destroy it," he said without turning around. "Many have tried. The clock is bound to this house, to this family. It's part of your very essence now." "I won't let it take me," Eleanor said, grabbing a poker from the fireplace. "I'll smash it to pieces." "Look closer," Thaddeus said sadly. Look at the silver inlays. Really look. Eleanor approached the clock hesitantly. The silver panels were moving again, but now she could see the scenes more clearly. And what she saw made her drop the poker in shock. The figures in the panels weren't random victims. They were Blackwoods. She recognized the faces from the portraits upstairs. There was her great-great-grandfather, being pulled into the clock's mechanism. There was her grandfather, whom she had never met, screaming as the clock hands pierced his heart. And there, in the newest panel, was a scene that made her blood turn to ice. It showed her, Eleanor, standing in this very room, but she wasn't alone. Behind her stood dozens of other figures, all bearing the Blackwood features, all reaching out toward her with desperate, pleading expressions. "They're all here," Thaddeus whispered. "Every Blackwood who has ever fed the clock. They're trapped inside, conscious but powerless, forced to watch as their descendants face the same fate." Eleanor stared at the panel, and slowly, the truth began to dawn on her. "You're not just the caretaker, are you?" Thaddeus turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw his features clearly. The sharp cheekbones, the piercing blue eyes, the aristocratic nose. He was a Blackwood. "I am Thaddeus Blackwood," he said quietly. "I came to claim my inheritance in 1889. I was 34 years old, a successful businessman from New York. I thought I was so clever, so modern, too sophisticated to believe in curses and demons." "But you survived," Eleanor said desperately. "You're still here." "Am I?" Thaddeus smiled sadly. "Look at my hands, Eleanor." She looked down and gasped. His hands were translucent, and she could see the floor through them. As she watched, his entire form flickered like a candle flame in the wind. "I am neither alive nor dead," he continued. "I am bound to this house, forced to serve the clock and guide each new Blackwood to their fate. I cannot rest until the curse is broken." The clock began to chime, its deep, resonant voice echoing through the mansion. Eleanor counted the strikes. 11 times it rang, each note seeming to sink deeper into her bones. "One more hour," she whispered. "There is a way," Thaddeus said urgently. "But it requires great sacrifice, and I'm not sure you're strong enough. Tell me." The clock feeds on Blackwood blood, but it was created by a Blackwood. Cornelius built a weakness into it, a way to break the curse if someone was brave enough to try. Eleanor's heart pounded. What kind of weakness? The clock must be fed at midnight, but the choice of what to feed it is left to the Blackwood. For 3 centuries, my family has chosen the easy path. They've given themselves to the clock rather than face the alternative. What alternative? Thaddeus pointed to the base of the clock, where Eleanor noticed a small door she hadn't seen before. Inside there is a chamber where the demon that powers the clock resides. If someone enters that chamber and destroys the demon's physical form, the curse will be broken. But the chamber is designed to kill anyone who enters it. The demon won't give up its hold on this world easily. Eleanor stared at the small door, barely large enough for a person to crawl through. "And if I don't try?" "Then you join us," Thaddeus said, gesturing to the silver panels. "Conscious but powerless, watching as your children and grandchildren face the same choice." The clock chimed again, a single ominous strike that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. It was 11:30. Eleanor made her decision. Eleanor knelt before the small door at the base of the clock. Her hands shook as she reached for the handle, but she forced herself to be steady. She had always been practical, always logical, but sometimes logic meant facing the impossible. The door opened with a grinding sound, revealing a narrow passage that descended into darkness. The air that wafted out was hot and thick, carrying with it the smell of sulfur and decay. Eleanor could hear something moving in the depths, a wet, sliding sound that made her skin crawl. "Remember," Thaddeus said behind her, "the demon will try to break your mind before it kills your body. It will show you visions, make you see things that aren't there. You must focus on your purpose." Eleanor nodded and began to crawl into the passage. The walls were lined with the same black ebony as the clock, but here the wood was warm to the touch, almost alive. Carved into the walls were more symbols, glowing with a faint red light that provided just enough illumination to see by. The passage seemed to go on forever, sloping downward into the earth beneath the mansion. Eleanor's knees scraped against the rough wood, and she could feel splinters embedding themselves in her skin. But she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that failure meant not just her death, but the continuation of the curse for future generations. Finally, the passage opened into a circular chamber about the size of a small room. The walls were covered in the same glowing symbols, and the air was so thick with heat that Eleanor could barely breathe. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and on that pedestal sat something that made Eleanor's sanity reel. It was a heart, but not a human heart. This organ was the size of a large watermelon, black as coal, and it pulsed with a rhythm that matched the ticking of the clock above. Veins of silver ran through its surface, and with each pulse, the symbol on the walls grew brighter. "So," a voice whispered from everywhere and nowhere, "another Blackwood comes to feed me." Eleanor looked around the chamber but saw no one. Then she realized the voice was coming from the heart itself. "I am not here to feed you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm here to end this." The heart's pulsing quickened, and suddenly the chamber was filled with visions. Eleanor saw her ancestors, all the Blackwoods who had come before her, screaming as they were absorbed into the clock's mechanism. She saw herself as a child, playing in a park, unaware of the curse that awaited her. She saw possible futures, children she might have had, lives she might have lived, all stolen by the creature before her. "You cannot destroy me," the voice hissed. "I am eternal. I am time itself." But Eleanor had spent her life surrounded by books, by knowledge, and she remembered something from Cornelius's journal. She pulled out a small silver knife she had taken from the kitchen and held it up. The blade gleamed with its own light in the chamber. "You're not time," she said. "You're just a parasite that feeds on it. And Cornelius was cleverer than you thought." The heart's pulsing became frantic. "What do you mean?" "He made you vulnerable to silver blessed by Blackwood blood. He knew that someday, one of his descendants would be brave enough to face you." Eleanor raised the knife and brought it down toward the heart. But as she did, the chamber exploded into chaos. The walls began to bleed, and the symbols writhed like living things. The heart screamed, a sound like nails on a chalkboard mixed with the dying breath of 1,000 souls. The creature fought back with everything it had. Eleanor felt her mind being assaulted by images of horror and despair. She saw herself failing, saw the knife turning in her hand to stab herself instead of the heart. She saw Thaddeus laughing, revealing that this had all been a trick, that there was no way to break the curse. But through it all, she held on to one thought: the faces of her ancestors in the silver panels, pleading for release. They had suffered for 3 centuries, and she was their only hope. With a cry of determination, Eleanor drove the silver knife deep into the heart. The blade sank in easily, and immediately the chamber filled with a light so bright it was like looking into the sun. The heart let out one final, ear-splitting shriek, and then it began to crumble. The chamber shook violently, and Eleanor realized she had to get out before the whole structure collapsed. She crawled frantically back through the passage as the walls began to crack and crumble behind her. The clock above was chiming midnight, but now the chimes were discordant, broken, like a dying voice. Eleanor emerged from the passage just as the great clock gave one final, shuddering tick and then fell silent. The silver panels went dark, and the hands stopped moving. For the first time in 3 centuries, the timekeeper was dead. Thaddeus stood before the clock, but now he was solid, real, no longer translucent. Around him, Eleanor could see other figures materializing. Dozens of them, all bearing the Blackwood features. They were the ancestors, freed at last from their prison. "Thank you," Thaddeus said, tears streaming down his face. "You've given us all our freedom." One by one, the ancestral spirits began to fade, moving on to whatever waited beyond. They each nodded to Eleanor as they passed, their faces peaceful for the first time in centuries. Last to go was Cornelius himself, a tall man with kind eyes and the bearing of a craftsman. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I never meant for it to go so far." "I know," Eleanor replied. "You did what you could." And then he was gone, and Eleanor was alone with Thaddeus in the silent drawing room. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked. Thaddeus smiled, a real smile this time, full of warmth and life. "Now we both get to live. The curse is broken, The demon is dead, and the Blackwood line is free." Eleanor nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized was there. But as she looked around the room, something nagged at her. The clock was dead, yes, but the mansion itself still felt wrong somehow. "Thaddeus," she said slowly, "how long have you been here?" "Since 1889, he replied. "Why? And you've been guiding Blackwoods to their fate all this time?" "Yes, it was my punishment for trying to escape the curse myself." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. "But if you've been here since 1889, and you've been guiding Blackwoods to the clock, how many have there been?" Thaddeus's smile faltered. I don't understand. How many Blackwoods have died to feed the clock since you've been here?" Thaddeus counted on his fingers, his face growing pale. 37. There have been 37. 37 people in 134 years? That's one every 3 to 4 years. Eleanor's mind was racing. "But you said every generation had to feed the clock. Generations are usually 20 to 30 years apart." Thaddeus stared at her, realization dawning in his eyes. "No," he whispered. "No, that's not possible. What if the curse wasn't just about feeding the clock once per generation?" Eleanor continued. "What if it was about feeding it regularly, and you've been helping?" The truth hit them both at the same time. The curse hadn't been about one sacrifice per generation. It had been about one sacrifice whenever the clock grew hungry. And Thaddeus, in his desire to end his own suffering, had been luring Blackwoods to the mansion far more frequently than necessary. "I've been a monster," Thaddeus said, his voice breaking. "I've been no better than the demon." Eleanor felt a moment of anger, but then she saw the genuine horror and remorse in his eyes. "You were trapped too," she said quietly. "The demon was using you just as much as it used the clock. But those people, those 37 people, are free now," Eleanor finished. "They're all free now. And so are you." As dawn broke over Greystone Manor, Eleanor and Thaddeus stood in the drawing room, looking at the silent clock. In the morning light, it looked like nothing more than an elaborate piece of furniture, its malevolent presence gone forever. "What will you do now?" Eleanor asked. Thaddeus looked around the mansion, taking in the portraits of his ancestors, the dusty furniture, the oppressive atmosphere that had been his prison for so long. "I think I'll leave this place. I've spent enough time here. And the house. It's yours, as the inheritance stated. But I wouldn't recommend staying. Too many memories, too much pain." Eleanor nodded. She had been thinking the same thing. "I'll sell it. Maybe donate the money to charity. Something good should come from all this suffering." They spent the morning going through the mansion, gathering important documents and personal items. In Cornelius's study, they found his original plans for the clock, along with detailed notes about the demon he had summoned. Eleanor burned them all in the fireplace, making sure that no one would ever be able to repeat his mistake. As they prepared to leave, Thaddeus turned to Eleanor one last time. "I want you to know," he said, "that of all the Blackwoods I've met, you were the only one brave enough to face the truth. The others, they were good people, but they were looking for easy answers. You were willing to sacrifice everything to save people you'd never met." "They were family," Eleanor replied simply. They left Greystone Manor together, driving away in Eleanor's old Ford as the sun climbed higher in the sky. In the rearview mirror, Eleanor watched the mansion grow smaller and smaller until it was just a dark spot on the horizon. 6 months later, Eleanor received a letter from a real estate agent in Ravens Hollow. Greystone Manor had burned down in a mysterious fire, leaving nothing but a pile of ash and rubble. The local fire department had no explanation for the blaze, and there were no signs of arson. Eleanor wasn't surprised. Some things were too tainted to continue existing in the world. She had used her inheritance to establish a scholarship fund for young women pursuing careers in library science. It seemed fitting, using money that came from centuries of death and suffering to help others learn and grow. Thaddeus had found work as a clockmaker in a small town in Vermont, using skills he had learned in his original life over a century ago. He specialized in restoration work, bringing old timepieces back to life with patience and care. He never worked on anything too large or elaborate, preferring simple, honest clocks that told time and nothing more. Eleanor returned to her job at the Boston Public Library, but she had changed. She was more confident now, more willing to take risks and face the unknown. She had looked into the heart of darkness and emerged victorious, and that knowledge gave her strength. Sometimes, late at night, she would wake to the sound of ticking. But it was just the small alarm clock on her nightstand, marking the passage of ordinary time in an ordinary world. She would lie in bed and listen to its steady rhythm, grateful for its simplicity. The curse was broken. The demon was dead. And time, blessed ordinary time, moved forward as it should, 1 second at a time, carrying all of them toward whatever future awaited. In the end, Eleanor reflected, that was all anyone could ask for. The gift of time, unmarked by curses or demons, flowing like a river toward the sea. It was the most precious inheritance of all.